Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Simcyp Technic webinar. My name is Xian Pan, and I'm part of Translational DMPK group at Simcyp. I will host today's session. So today's topic focuses on the dynamic pH-dependent DDI modeling. Before we start talk, I'd like to kindly request that everyone stay muted during the presentation. Should you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or post your query in the chat box. We have a dedicated Q&A session at the end where we will address them. So we're recording today's presentation, which will be available on YouTube shortly. Next slide, please. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Yan Ip. She's a senior scientist in oral absorption team at Simcyp Certara. She has joined us in 2020 and has a strong interest in the role of the lipids in food effects and the pH-dependent drug-drug interaction. I'm glad to have her today. Her talk today will cover the introduction to the version 23 gastric pH interaction features for the pH-DDI modeling and a few considerations, and also upcoming relevant compound files. So without further ado, I will hand over to Yan. Over to you, Yan.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Xian, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining in for the webinar today. So I'll start by giving a very brief background to pH-dependent drug-drug interactions, as well as the use of PBPK to model them. So as we know, these are a type of absorption drug-drug interaction where the victim drugs exhibit pH-dependent solubility. And the DDI takes place because the gastric pH changes that follow administration of acid-reducing agents, such as your proton pump inhibitors and your H2 blockers, they bring about the gastric pH change, which in turn changes the solubility and the extent of dissolution for these compounds that ultimately affects bioavailability. So it's a relatively straightforward mechanism of interaction, and PBPK has been used to assess DDI risks. However, the strategies so far mostly relied on a static pH adjustment approach, where the pH of the stomach compartment can be manipulated to resemble a worst case scenario. And that's usually a value of 6 in terms of PPIs and a value of 7 in the case of H2 blockers. So what this means is that the gastric pH is maintained pH at 6 or 7 at all times using the static approach. But if we contrast that to what actually happens in the stomach that's measured, we can see that after the administration of Esomeprazole 40 milligrams, gastric pH doesn't stay at 6 at all times, but rather there is a ramping up period and a coming down period, and it spends considerable time below pH 6. So while this static approach is very useful in terms of characterizing worst case, it may not be so useful in terms of assessing mitigation strategies. For example, where you're trying to mitigate the presence of a DDI by performing staggered administration or using alternative formulations. So in that case, dynamic pH modeling, where there's time dependency in gastric pH, can be much more useful to assess these mitigation strategies. So recognizing this, in version 23, which is the current version of Simcyp, we have introduced this new functionality to enable users to model the PBPK PD effect of an ARA, and bring about a time-dependent change in gastric pH. So this gastric pH interaction feature was introduced in version 23 by our pH-DDI project team. So let's take a look at what it is, where you can find it, and how can you use it. So to begin, the new interaction facility can be found within compound files and more specifically substrate and inhibitor files. So within the interaction section, you would find a new gastric pH tab whereby you can activate the modeling of gastric pH effects. So once this is activated, you will have the option to select from 3 effect models that are available. And each of these models have their unique PD parameters, input fields that are associated with them. So you'd see here in bold that 2 of the effect models are grouped under a semi-mechanistic H+ model being active, and 1 of the effect model is under this H+ model being inactive. So the activation state of the H+ model really refers to the underlying gastric pH model, whereby if the H+ model is inactive, that refers to our default gastric pH model, which is based on observed fasted and fed pH values. So there's nothing mechanistic about this model, and therefore the general acid reducing agent effect model modulates gastric pH directly. In contrast, under the H+ model active selections, that refers to the activation state of the H+ model within the stomach pH part of the simulator. And once this H+ model is activated, the gastric pH utilizes a semi-mechanistic model to calculate gastric pH dynamically, utilizing real-time concentrations of gastric acid. So within this model, we include the gastric acid secretion rate into the stomach, as well as emptying rate out of the stomach to obtain a real-time amount of gastric acid. We also are able to monitor the dynamic changes in stomach fluid volume. So if you take in a volume of food or drink a glass of water, for example, that can impact on the volume of the stomach and therefore the concentration of the gastric acid and therefore pH. So in a nutshell, this model is more mechanistic and is sensitive to the impact of food and drink on gastric pH. It is also sensitive to changes in stomach volume as well as gastric emptying, for example, if that is part of the pharmacological effect of your drug. So within this option, the H2 receptor antagonist effect model works to reversibly inhibit gastric acid secretion, whereas the proton pump inhibitor works to irreversibly inhibit gastric acid secretion. So here it's worth sort of highlighting that the naming of the model itself is arbitrary and it depends on the mechanism of action. So what I mean to say here is that if you've got an ARA that reversibly inhibits gastric acid secretion that is not at the H2 histamine receptor, you could still utilize this effect model to model gastric pH. So now that we've gone through the background of the feature, I'll just move on to the simulator itself to show you where the feature is. So as mentioned, if you went to a compound file and the interaction screen, you'd see the feature under the gastric pH tab. And what you can do is to activate the model, and you can now select 1 out of 3 effect models. So if you selected the H2 receptor antagonist, that you then input your sigmoid Emax model parameters to modulate gastric acid secretion. If you selected the proton pump inhibitor option, you would then modulate the proton pump relative activity via the Kr and Kdeg parameters that will ultimately modulate the secretion rate as well. And thirdly, if you selected the general acid reducing agent option, this is based on a sigmoid Emax model to directly modulate gastric pH. So you'd also have the option to select the driving concentration for the effect. So you can choose between total or free plasma concentration, or if you need to delay the onset of duration of the effect, you can also select an effect compartment and parameterize the exit rate constant here. So now I just wanted to sort of stress the importance of the compatibility of the underlying gastric pH model with the effect model that's selected. So as mentioned, the default state of the H+ model is for it to be inactive. So in this case, if we selected an incompatible effect model, let's say the PPI model, and you try to start a simulation, what you'll come across is a validation error that will prompt you to go and change the model of your gastric pH. And you can do that quite easily by clicking on this Go To button. That will take you straight to the gastric pH screen in the population tabs, where you can activate the H+ model and then navigate back to the gastric pH interaction screen. And if you started your simulation, this will then proceed without error. So the idea here is that if you've got these sort of parameters, your KR, KDAC parameters, for example, from the literature, you can use them as starting values to model the effect on gastric pH and see if you can recover the observed pH that way. So in order to do that, you'd need to obviously be able to access the gastric pH outputs. And you do that by navigating to the MADAM options page and checking the time-dependent gastric pH checkbox here. You also have the option in Excel options to overlay your observed gastric pH time data in the form of an XML file. So the way you can generate this XML file is very similar to the way you would generate a concentration time XML file. So you can do this in Excel with a Simcyp plugin, but you need to make sure that it's the version 23 plugin that is installed. So that will allow you to select in the dependent variable section gastric pH as well as gastric pH in the presence of an inhibitor as dependent variable, and then go ahead to input your time and observe gastric pH profile. So once you've done that, you can save that as a PE file, an XML file, and then navigate back to your workspace and attach that to be overlaid. So now we can start the simulation. I've done this earlier, prepared this output earlier, and we can see that this is the output for the workspace that we were looking at. So in this case, this is about omeprazole multiple dosing, and we can see that in the plasma concentration time profiles that omeprazole takes multiple dose to arrive at steady state. And that is reflected in the stomach pH profile outputs as well. So here we can see that the impact of omeprazole on increasing stomach pH has been modeled, and the observed data has been overlaid onto the profile. We also output the inhibition of gastric acid secretion rate by omeprazole in this file here. And like many Simcyp outputs, we report population statistics in terms of mean and percentile data. But importantly, we also output individual statistics. So these are individual stomach pH time profiles for all the individuals that are used in this simulation. And I highlight this in this webinar because this can be very useful for your PD analysis, because in studies for acid-reducing agents, what is frequently reported as PD parameters would be your median pH, mean pH, and the percent time spent above pH 4. So if you have the raw data available, you can analyze this data and come up with your PD parameters for your predicted profiles. So, for example, that will then allow you to present your gastric pH simulations in this way, where you can attempt to recover the percent time spent above pH 4, for example, or the median pH against the observed. So this really gives you a quantitative way to assess the performance of your model, in addition to the visual way of assessing model performance. So we've basically now looked at how we can optimize the parameters within this functionality to best recover gastric pH. And once you're satisfied with that, the ARA file here can now be used as a perpetrator for pH-dependent DDIs. So for that purpose, I've set up a workspace just to give you an example of how we can simulate a clinical study like that. So in this study, I'm trying to simulate the impact of esomeprazole on the absorption of posaconazole suspension. So I've loaded the esomeprazole file in the inhibitor position, made sure that the gastric pH interaction function is switched on, and then appropriately parameterized. So this will ensure that there is an impact on gastric pH. And then for my victim file, I have loaded that in the substrate position. And here I just wanted to highlight that the victim file itself needs to be a file that can be susceptible to changes in gastric pH. So what I mean by that is really that there are sort of certain requirements for the victim files in order for it to be sensitive to changes in gastric pH. So in a nutshell, there needs to be a pH sensitive component to the absorption model of the victim file. So here I've just made a mock-up pie chart to show that in order for a file to be suitable to be used as a victim file, it needs to be, the minimum requirement is that it needs to have mechanistic absorption selected, so either your ADAM or AMADAM model. And there needs to be a pH-sensitive component, and that's often in the form of a diffusion layer model being utilized. So the DLM is a SimSIP's mechanistic model for dissolution, and it is very sensitive to the changes in luminal pH in the stomach. Other than that, if you had other pH-sensitive component, for example, in terms of release or degradation, that would mean that the victim file can be sensitive to changes in pH too. In contrast, the legend that's shown in green here just shows the model that you can use that would not be sensitive to gastric pH. So for example, if your victim file utilizes the first order absorption model or it uses the solution formulation in ADAM, there will be no sensitivity to gastric pH there because in these models, all the compound would be assumed to be in solution, and therefore gastric pH cannot impact on dissolution in these cases. Likewise, if you opted for a direct input of in vitro dissolution profile that is not sensitive to gastric pH, that would not be an appropriate victim file as well. So with that explained, so when you have your pH-DDI interaction workspace set up, in this slide, I just wanted to go through quickly the outputs that you might be interested in order to gain mechanistic insight into your DDI. So as mentioned, you can opt to output the time-dependent gastric pH profiles to investigate how gastric pH changes in the presence of your inhibitor. You can also opt to output time-dependent solubility profiles to see how drug solubility is affected by changes in gastric pH. And you might also be interested in the gastrointestinal tract profiles, where you can select compartments of interest. And in case of pH-DDI, you might be more interested in stomach and duodenal profiles and investigate, for example, the dissolution rate, the amount of dissolved drug, and the luminal concentration in these compartments. So for example, these sort of profiles where you can compare the amount of dissolved drug between the stomach and the duodenum in the presence and absence of an inhibitor can be very useful to understand the mechanisms of the DDI. So now that we've covered what the functionality is, how to parameterize them, and how to set up a pH-DDI interaction workspace, I just wanted to use this opportunity to draw to your attention that in the upcoming version of SimSip, so version 24, that will be released by the end of this year, we have for 3 of the ARA files that we have in the library database, Omeprazole, Esomeprazole, and Ranitidine, we have updated the PD parameters for these files. So how will these files look like in version 24? And a disclaimer here to say that this is a demo only. The interface and the values may be different in the release version. So if you loaded one of these compounds, what you would notice is that in the gastric pH tab, the PD parameters would have been pre-populated. So we've done the work in terms of optimizing these parameters against observed gastric pH for you, so that if you wanted to use the file as a pH-DDI perpetrator, all you need to do is to activate this gastric pH functionality and make sure that the compatible gastric pH model is selected. And now, if we're going to put forward sort of these sort of functionalities for users, I guess a very sort of reasonable next question is that has the feature actually been verified? And to this point, because this is a technical webinar, I won't go into the details, the verification work that we've done, other than to say that the data in the following slides will be presented in the upcoming SimSip Consortium meeting in September, and that we are working to get this published in the form of a manuscript. So to answer the question, yes, we have verified for the performance for this model, and we've done that at 2 levels. So the first level is in terms of gastric pH verification, where we have shown that for Omeprazole, Esomeprazole, and Ranitidine, the PD models was able to recover the percent time spent above pH 4, the median and mean pH, across multiple dosing regimen, including the maximum doses. And the maximum doses point is important because these are usually the doses that are used in pH-DDI studies. And if you wanted to visualize the data, you can see from these representative plots here that we are able to successfully recover the time dependency of the gastric pH profiles following placebo administration. So here we can capture the effect of a drink as well as meals on increasing gastric pH. We can also capture multiple dose Omeprazole administration, multiple dose Esomeprazole administration, as well as single dose Ranitidine administration. So here I just wanted to highlight that if we were going to use these PBPK PD models to, for example, assess in silico the approach of staggered administration, it can be really important to be able to capture very well the start and the end of the gastric pH profiles. Because if you're going to sort of dose your compound 2 hours before the ARA or let's say 12 hours after the ARA, it's important to be able to capture the ramp up and the coming down properly. In terms of the second level of verification, we have also utilized the Omeprazole, Esomeprazole, and Ranitidine files as pH-DDI perpetrators to show that we can recover pH-dependent DDIs. So here we're looking for a qualitative and as well as a quantitative sort of performance verification, where we're not only looking for the ability to predict the presence of an interaction, but also to make sure that the functionality can recover the absence of an interaction, as well as, you know, when there is an interaction that it's captured in the right direction and the correct extent. So utilizing a series of pH-DDI studies, some with the presence of pH-DDI and some without, we can see here on the right that the dynamic pH modeling was able to recover the observed Cmax and AUC ratios very well. And while we're on this slide, I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight one of the key benefits of the model that we've implemented, because it's so easy to switch off and on this feature. What it allows us to do is to explore different settings and gain a deeper insight into the DDI itself. So, for example, in this setting 1 column here, what I've done is to switch off the functionality for gastric pH so that the DDI simulations only reflect the enzyme and transporter mediated part of the interaction. In this setting 2 column, I have kept the functionality switched off, but utilized the static worst case stomach pH approach to model the DDIs. And then in this third approach here, I have, this is the most realistic approach where the dynamic gastric pH functionality is switched on. So we're looking at DDI that is from the enzymes, transporters, as well as gastric pH. So that allows you to just compare between the outcomes of simulation. For example, by comparing setting 1 and setting 3, that can tell you about the relative contribution of your enzymes and transporters to the interaction as compared to gastric pH. And if you compare setting 2 and setting 3, for example, that tells you about the relative performance of the static approach against the dynamic approach. And here in our simulations, it shows that the dynamic approach was superior to the static approach, not just in quantitative predictions, but in the ability to pick out the presence and the absence of a DDI as well. So here we use posaconazole DDI to illustrate that. So it's an interesting drug in that when, depending on the formulation you dose it in, it either exhibits a presence of an interaction if you dose the suspension formulation, or a lack of a pH-DDI interaction if you dose the late release tablet formulation. And here we can show that with the dynamic approach, we were able to predict the presence and absence of the interaction correctly, whereas in the static worst case approach, we would have predicted the presence of an interaction for both formulations. So this just highlights the potential utility of the dynamic approach in terms of assessing such mitigation strategies. So we've reached the end of the webinar here, and I just want to finish off by summarizing some pertinent points. And the first is to say that the static way of modeling pH-DDIs can be very useful to characterize worst case, and in SimSip we have been able to do that for many years now. We've recently introduced the dynamic pH functionality based on PBPK-PD modeling, and combined with mechanistic absorption models, these lead to improved pH-DDI predictions qualitatively and quantitatively. And that just suggests that dynamic pH modeling can be uniquely suited to model pH-DDI mitigation strategies in silico, such as staggered administration and alternative formulations. And lastly, one of the benefits of the model is that the ease with which it can be used to separate the DMAT versus the gastric pH mediated DDI. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions if there's sufficient time.
Okay, thank you, Yan. And now let's move to the Q&A session. Please, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand or you could type in your question in the chat. It seems we already get a few in the chat. So, so Jennifer has 2 questions for you. First one is will the KDAG and the KOR parameter load automatically when you select Omeprazole, Esomeprazole, and the Ranitidine file in the simulator, or we need to enter them manually?
Yes. So in version 24, which is the upcoming version, these parameters will be preloaded for you. So they'll be grayed out, but the values will be there. And all you need to do is to switch on the functionality. So that's in the upcoming version. That's the way we will set up the compound files. In the current version 23 that you will have available, these parameters are not in there. The default parameters, they are designed not to do anything to the gastric pH in version 23. But to answer the question, in version 24, these will be pre-populated.
Sorry, can I just ask a follow-up? So if we are doing some assessments right now in version 23 and we want to do an assessment like this, are we able to take these values and incorporate them in a certain way in 23 to do that assessment, or do you think we need to wait for 24?
Well, if you have access to these values, for example, by corresponding with us, or it's something that you can definitely try. It's just that for esomeprazole in version 23, it's still a first order model. So in version 24, we've actually updated that to ADAM, and the key reason for that is to enable the use of the file with food staggering, so you can actually investigate, multiple dosing or food events and try and model your gastric pH that way. So the file for version 24 and version 23 for esomeprazole, for example, will be different. So the performance is retained in terms of your PK and DDI predictions, that's retained, but the model itself is different. So if you do obtain the parameters from us, what you can do is to try it. You can input it in your version 23 file and then simulate the gastric pH and see if it matches the published observed gastric pH data following esomeprazole administration. So basically, it wouldn't be done for you. It should be close, the parameters that we use. It should give you a very close prediction of gastric pH, but because it is a different model, we would still recommend that you perform the gastric pH verification yourself in that case.
Sure. Thank you. I think that was the follow-up question I had, and we can skip that. We'll reach out to the consultation to get access to that data. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No worries.
Okay, so we have another question. So it's from Natalia. Is asking, does the dynamic pH model account for circadian rhythm effect on gastric pH?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The quick answer for that is no, it doesn't. So this is strictly a PK/PD effect modeling. And you can actually see in one of the profiles here for the omeprazole profile that we are unable to capture that sort of nocturnal rise in gastric pH due to circadian rhythm. So, the limitation here is that, this would be useful, for example, if your compound is co-administered with your ARA, but if your compound, is administered at night, for example, this might not be the most useful approach. However, having said that, we can utilize a few sort of offerings in SimSip to try and bridge that gap for you. For example, the use of SimSip Designer or even Lua coding to ensure that sort of nocturnal rise in gastric pH is captured. So in short, the current model doesn't do that, but there are ways that we can use to get around this nocturnal pH modeling effect.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Okay, we got one more comment. It's from Xiao Yu, who's asking, what are the PK behavior that new dynamic pH-DDI model can capture, but the static DDI, I think static pH model cannot?
Yeah, well, that really requires, so to answer the question, I think this is sort of best illustrated in sort of this slide here, where we assess the sort of prediction accuracy for the DDIs of the static approach versus the dynamic approach. And because it is a more real sort of dynamic approach is a more realistic capture of gastric pH. So that sort of, as expected, leads to a improved prediction of the extent of the DDI itself. So the static pH is overkill, and for some cases, it just leads to a bit of subpar predictions. And in cases where it is very important to, for example, capture the time dependency of the gastric pH rise and fall. So, for example, in the posaconazole DR tablet example here, this sort of difference, the ramping up stage of the difference versus, a gastric pH that is sits at 6, at 7 all the time, that was enough to make the difference between the modeling of the presence of an interaction or not. So just as a quick answer to the question, it's just better in terms of prediction accuracy. And not only that, it was also better in terms of the ability to predict the presence and absence of an interaction. And I think it would be particularly important if you're going to assess staggered administration as a mitigation strategy, because if you don't have the dynamic pH profile, it really doesn't matter when you dose your compound. It will just, be exposed to a high pH at all times. Whereas if you dose your compound, say, for example, 2 hours before, you really have a 4-hour window before gastric pH hits the high value of 7. So that can be important in terms of assessing these mitigation strategies.
Okay, thank you. It seems there are no further questions. We will now bring this webinar to a close. Thank you, Ian, for guiding us on the pH-dependent DDI modeling, and looking forward to see your publication. Thank you to everyone for joining us and for your attention and active participation. Should you have additional queries later on, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Ian, would you mind to post the last slides for me?
Oh, yes, that's very sorry about that. I will do that. We do have a last slide to share.
I think it's 17. Okay, thank you. So our next technique webinar is scheduled for the 11th of September. In this upcoming session, Harry Moore will talk about the SimSip report assistant. So if you're interested in it, please register through the members area. Once again, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you soon. Have a lovely day and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.